In reggae music, there are performers, there are prophets. Peter Tosh was both, but before he became the stepping razor, before he stood alongside Bob Marley as one of reggae's founding fathers, he was simply Winston Hubert McIntosh, a young man who loved deeply. This is not the story of his rise to fame. This is not the story of his political activism or his musical genius. This is the story of how one tragic night in 1973 changed everything. How losing the woman he loved most transformed Peter Tosh from a hopeful young artist into reggae's most militant voice. To understand the depth of Peter Tosh's later pain, we must first understand the height of his early joy. Born Winston Hubert McIntosh in 1944 in rural Jamaica, he came to Kingston in the early 1960s with nothing but a guitar and dreams bigger than the island itself. It was in Kingston where Winston met two other young dreamers, Robert Nesta Marley and Neville Bunny Livingston. Together, they would form the Wailers, a group that would revolutionize not just Jamaican music, but popular music worldwide. Peter had taught Bob Marley how to play the guitar, and their musical chemistry was undeniable. But while Bob was the natural frontman and Bunny the spiritual center, Peter brought something else, an edge, a militancy that would define his entire career. The early Wailers hits Simmer Down, Rude Boy, One Love showcased a group finding their voice. But for Peter, success wasn't just about music, it was about message, about change, about revolution. By the early 1970s, the Wailers were on the verge of international breakthrough. Island Records had signed them. Albums were being planned. The world was about to discover reggae music through these three young men from Trenchtown. Her name was Yvonne, and she entered Peter Tosh's life when everything seemed possible. While historical records tell us little about her beyond the tragedy that would claim her life, those who knew Peter during this time speak of a transformation. The militant Peter Tosh, already known for his uncompromising stance on social justice, had found something worth being gentle for. Friends from that era remember seeing Peter laugh more, worry less about the revolution, and talk about building a future. Peter was different with Yvonne, still serious about the music, still conscious about the struggle, but lighter, you know? Like he had found his balance. This was the early 1970s in Jamaica, a time of social upheaval and political violence. But for Peter and Yvonne, love provided sanctuary from the chaos. In her, he found not just a partner, but someone who understood his mission without trying to change it. The music Peter created during this period reflects this emotional security. Songs like 400 Years and Small Axe still carried his revolutionary message, but they were tempered with hope, a belief that change was not just necessary, but possible. Yvonne wasn't just Peter's girlfriend, she was his anchor. In a world where Peter Tosh was becoming known as the most uncompromising Wailer, she was the one person who saw him as simply Winston, the man behind the message. It was 1973. Peter was driving home with his girlfriend Yvonne when his car was hit by another car driving on the wrong side of the road. In that single moment, everything Peter Tosh believed about love, about future, about hope, was shattered. The accident killed Yvonne and severely fractured Tosh's skull. Yvonne was badly crushed and remained in a coma for 3 weeks before she died. For 21 days, Peter Tosh sat by her bedside, watching the love of his life slip away. Those 3 weeks changed Peter Tosh forever. Friends who visited the hospital spoke of watching a man die spiritually while his body healed physically. The skull fractures would mend. The broken heart never would. When Yvonne finally passed, something fundamental shifted in Peter's worldview. The man who had preached about Babylon's evils through song now felt those evils personally. The revolution was no longer ideological, it was personal. At Yvonne's funeral, those present said Peter stood silent throughout the entire service. No tears, no words. Just a stone-faced acceptance that the world was crueler than even his most militant songs had suggested. After that night, after losing Yvonne, Peter never talked about building anything again. Only about tearing down. Only about justice. Only about making Babylon pay. For months after the accident, Peter couldn't make music. The guitar that had once been his voice sat silent. The man who had always found solace in rhythm could no longer hear the beat through his grief. But when Peter Tosh finally returned to music, he returned as a different man entirely. The hope was gone. The gentle balance Yvonne had provided was gone. What remained was pure, unfiltered rage. And the musical world would never be the same. When Peter Tosh returned to the Wailers after Yvonne's death, his bandmates barely recognized him. The collaborative spirit was gone. The willingness to compromise was gone. What remained was a man with nothing left to lose. This new Peter Tosh clashed immediately with the Wailers' commercial ambitions. While Bob Marley was increasingly willing to soften the political message for mainstream success, Peter demanded the opposite. More militancy, more confrontation, more truth, regardless of commercial consequences. After Island Records president Chris Blackwell refused to issue his solo album in 1974, Tosh and Bunny Wailer left the Wailers unable to reconcile their vision with the group's commercial direction. For Peter, this wasn't just a business decision, it was inevitable. He could no longer pretend to be hopeful. Peter's solo career launched with an intensity that startled even longtime reggae fans. Songs like Legalize It and Equal Rights weren't just protest songs. They were declarations of war against a system that had taken everything he loved. The man who had once sung about love now sang exclusively about struggle. The man who had once believed in gradual change now demanded immediate revolution. Yvonne's death had radicalized Peter Tosh in ways that no political theory ever could. His music became his therapy, but it was therapy through confrontation. Every song was a fight. Every performance was a battle. The grief he couldn't express personally poured out through speakers across the world. Peter's new militancy made him enemies. The Jamaican government banned his music. International venues refused to book him. But Peter didn't care about commercial success anymore. Success was survival, and survival meant fighting. Those closest to Peter during this period describe a man consumed by purpose, but empty of joy. He had found his voice as a solo artist, but it was a voice born entirely from loss. But even as Peter Tosh became reggae's most uncompromising voice, those who knew him before Yvonne's death could see the cost. The revolution had a warrior, but the man had lost his soul. Where his early Wailers work had spoken of one love, his solo work spoke of equal rights and justice. Where he had once sung, "I'm gonna put it on," now he demanded others get up, stand up. The optimism was gone, replaced by militant urgency. Stepping Razor became Peter's signature song, and his self-description, "A razor cuts both ways. It can heal by cutting away disease, or it can wound by cutting too deep." Peter Tosh had become both healer and wounded, surgeon and patient. His live performances took on an almost spiritual intensity. Audiences came expecting entertainment, but left feeling like they had witnessed a sermon, a therapy session, or a declaration of war. Peter had transformed his personal pain into universal protest. You could feel the pain in every note Peter played. He wasn't just performing revolution, he was living it. The personal had become political in the most profound way. Even when Peter covered other artists' work, like his famous version of Johnny B. Goode, he transformed them into statements of black pride and resistance. Everything he touched became part of his ongoing memorial to what he had lost. His relationships with other musicians became increasingly strained. Where he had once been collaborative, he was now confrontational. Where he had once been diplomatic, he was now uncompromising. The loss of Yvonne had cost him not just love, but the ability to trust or be gentle. Peter's insistence on complete creative control wasn't just artistic preference. It was survival mechanism. Having lost the one person who truly knew him, he could no longer risk vulnerability in any form. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Peter's post-Yvonne music was what was absent: love songs. In over a decade of solo recording, Peter Tosh never again sang about romantic love, about building a future with someone, about hope for personal happiness. That part of him had died in 1973. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Peter Tosh had achieved everything he claimed to want. His message was reaching global audiences. His music was influencing a generation of activists. But success had not brought him peace. Tosh was in a relationship with his wife Marlene Brown for about 5 years from 1982, and he had children with various partners over the years. But those close to him say he never again achieved the emotional intimacy he had shared with Yvonne. Peter could love his children, respect his woman, but he couldn't open his heart again, not fully. That part of him was buried with Yvonne. Ironically, as Peter became more isolated personally, his music became more globally influential. Artists worldwide began covering his songs, adopting his militant stance, carrying his message of resistance to new audiences. Get Up, Stand Up became an anthem for oppressed people worldwide. Equal Rights played at civil rights rallies. Legalize It became a battle cry for drug policy reform. Peter's personal pain had become universal inspiration. But by the mid-1980s, those who knew Peter well could see the toll his unrelenting militancy had taken. He looked older than his years. He trusted fewer people. He smiled even less frequently than before. Each performance had become an act of will rather than joy. Peter performed not because music brought him happiness, but because the message demanded to be heard. He had become a prisoner of his own revolutionary purpose. In rare, quiet moments, the mask would slip, and observers could see the man Yvonne's death had left behind. Brilliant, dedicated, influential, but fundamentally broken. He had weaponized his grief, but the weapon had wounded the warrior as much as his enemies. Peter had 10 children, and he provided for them financially and tried to guide them morally. But emotional availability remained difficult. The man who could move thousands with his music struggled to express tenderness in personal relationships. When Peter Tosh was murdered in his own home in September 1987, the world lost one of reggae's most important voices, but his death also marked the end of a 14-year period of music created entirely in the shadow of devastating personal loss. The tributes focused on his political contributions, his musical innovations, his uncompromising stance for justice. But few understood that beneath the militant exterior was a man who had never recovered from losing his heart in 1973. Peter taught us that music could be a weapon, that art could be activism, but listening to his work now, you can also hear the cost of that commitment. There's a clear demarcation in Peter Tosh's catalog. Preon, Navi Sechitres, there's hope, mixed with Post-1973, there's only the militancy. The accident didn't just change his personal life, but every statue erected in Peter's honor, every mural painted of his image, every young musician inspired by his example, stands as testament not just to his revolutionary spirit, but to the love he lost and never recovered. In the end, Peter Tosh's greatest revolution was the most personal one, transforming unbearable grief into unshakable purpose. He turned his broken heart into reggae's sharpest weapon, but the question that haunts his legacy is this. What music might Peter Tosh have made if love had lived instead of died? What songs might he have sung if hope had survived alongside militancy? We will never know the artist Peter Tosh might have become if Yvonne had lived. We only know the artist he became because she died. Militant, uncompromising, brilliant, and forever wounded. His music remains as powerful today as when he first stepped onto the stage as a solo artist, armed with nothing but his pain and his guitar. Stepping Razor, Equal Rights, Legalize It. These songs didn't just demand justice. They proved that art created from authentic suffering can change the world. New generations continue to find Peter Tosh's music, drawn by its uncompromising honesty and militant hope. They may not know the personal story behind the political message, but they feel the authentic pain that gives the music its power. In losing the love of his life, Peter Tosh found his voice as an artist. In being broken personally, he became unbreakable politically. In dying emotionally, he was reborn as reggae's most essential revolutionary. But behind every militant song, beneath every revolutionary anthem, within every call for justice, the ghost of young love lingers. Peter Tosh's music was his memorial to Yvonne, and his gift to a world that needed to hear what truth sounds like when it's born from authentic loss. Tragedy shaped the man, but the man shaped the music, and the music shaped the world.